Welcome back, viewers. In this video we're going to be doing a teardown of an EJ25. This is an EJ253 out of a 2005 Forester 5-speed. If you watched earlier videos this year, around March, April, I posted a video on purchasing this silver Forester. Last week or week before last, we did the teardown on what has now become known as the peanut butter milkshake EJ253. That was the blown head gasket engine out of the teal 2004 Outback I bought 2-3 weeks ago. So we got to see what the oil coolant mix did to the bearings, to the pistons, and everything else in that engine. Now we're going to be tearing this one down. This one was a salvage yard engine. It was put in, and shortly after the time it was installed, something happened and knocked a hole in the oil pan, ran the engine low on oil. It now has a rod knock. So we're going to tear down the short block. I'm going to do a little bit more step by step than we did on the last video, because of course it was time lapse, and see what all, running this engine out of oil, what all damage came out of that. We of course know we're going to have a bad rod bearing, at least one of them, because we do have a knock, but we're probably going to have some scoring on the main bearings as well as the other rod bearings, and possibly some scoring on pistons, but not sure how long or how severely it was ran without oil. Judging from the fact that the knock is very faint until the engine warms up, it's probably not that bad. They probably shut it down fairly quickly after the low oil pressure light came on, but I don't know for sure. So with that said, I'll get the camera moved around and we'll start tearing this down to the bare crankshaft. So we're going to start off at the rear of the engine. We've skipped ahead a little bit. I've already removed the piston pin access cover on this side. It is 2 Phillips head screws. You use an impact driver to get those out. You're going to struggle to get those out with a screwdriver, and most likely will tear up the heads of those screws with a screwdriver. You really need an impact driver. We've already removed the oil air separator plate. I do have another video on removing and installing this, so we'll skip that for now. And I've already removed the rear main seal. So now that we got the rear main seal out of the way, oil air separator plate out of the way, and the wrist pin access cover out of the way, we'll start by removing the access cover for the wrist pin on cylinder number 3. It is a 14mm hex. And they're under fairly low torque. Now to the front side of the engine, we'll go ahead and remove the 2 piston pin access covers on the front. Both again are 14mm hexes. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, we can turn our crankshaft until our wrist pin, as you can see through the hole, is lined up with the hole. Probably going to be a little difficult for this to come through on the camera. I will take a picture and put it on screen so you can see a little better what we got. But basically, we have the side of the piston here. We have a retaining ring, a little snap ring. Looks like this. It's not a traditional snap ring with holes in it. It just has those little tangs, and you grab those with needle nose pliers and compress them, pull them out. That's what holds your piston wrist pin in place. Once that's removed, we'll reach in there and pull the piston wrist pin out. Then we can pull our piston head out of the bore. There's a little snap ring out. Got that side of the way, we can reach in there and pull out the wrist pin. Or attempt to. A lot of times they're in there really tight. This is a tool I've made out of a old flathead screwdriver. But basically just ground it down and put a little tip on it to reach in there and grab the back of the pin and pull it out. But like I said, sometimes they get stuck in there. When that happens, you take a really long, narrow pin punch like I've got here. You'll reach in from the back access cover on the back cylinder and snake this through and tap on the back of that pin to dislodge it. Give it some taps to get it moving. It's really stuck in there good. You can see it starting to come out of the bore now. Might be able to pull it out. Still stuck in there really well. So we'll just continue to knock it out from the back side. Just like so. Once we're to here, put a little tool in, grab it from the back side. As you see there, we're just hooking on the back side there. As you see, we're just hooking that back lip there and pulling. So first wrist pin is out. Set that aside with the snap ring. Now what we can do use the connecting rod to push that piston head out. And you hear the connecting rod drop down into the cylinder bore. Now what we can do is reach in here and turn our piston about 90 degrees. Or attempt to, as you saw in the peanut butter milkshake video. I was having trouble doing that just due to the fact that no lubrication from that coolant oil mix. It stuck the pistons in there really well. So now that we've got that sticking out, we can turn it a little more. Run our rod back into that piston skirt and pop that piston right out of there. Oof. I thought the other engine was bad. We've got quite a bit of galling here on the piston skirt. Evidence from the low oil. This side not terrible, but definitely galling here on the top side of the piston. We'll look at the bore here once we get every other piston out of this block. But now that we got the piston out, we'll go ahead and put our wrist pin back in there. And our snap rings, set them off to the side, keep them in order. Now basically we just repeat this process 3 more times to remove the remaining 3 pistons from the engine. Now that we've got the piston out of cylinder 2, I'm going to take a rag and wrap it around the connecting rod. That way while we're turning the crank, the connecting rod is not scratching up and down against the bore, cylinder bore. So Go ahead and turn this till our pin is aligned with the access hole. Again, we'll reach in with our needle nose pliers. Grab our clip out, set our clip to the side. Again, we'll fish our punch through the rear. Backside of that backside of that piston pin, wrist pin. Give a couple whacks to loosen it up. Reach in with our tool. Set our wrist pin to the side. Turn the crank again. Connecting rod to push the piston head to the top of the bore. Bring the connecting rod back. Spin your piston 90 degrees if possible. And continue to spin. And pop that piston right out of there. Only a tiny little bit of galling right here on this piston. Got quite a bit here, so yeah, definitely ran low on oil or overheated or both at some point. Go ahead and put that that wrist pin back in. For our number 1 cylinder. So now that we've got both cylinder 1 and 2 free, we'll spin the engine back around and get to work on releasing 3 and 4. All right, moving on to cylinder number 4. Repeat process. Remove the clip. Remove your wrist pin. Again, pin out. Crank. Turn the piston. And pop it out.
And just like all the other pistons, a lot of galling on the skirts. All right, last piston about to come out. There we go, same galling on the skirts. I think this is the least damaged piston of them all. But yeah, all 4 pistons are now out. So now we will start to split the block. While we're here at the rear of the short block, we'll go ahead and remove this 12mm case bolt. This one you will need to remove with a wrench. You might be able to get a 1/4 inch drive in there, but usually you got to use a wrench. So go ahead and spin that out while we're back here. Set that to the side. Real quick, just by touch and sound, do you think you can tell me which rod bearing spun? So cylinder 1, cylinder 3, cylinder 2, and cylinder 4. Comment right now which bearing you think spun. Okay, so now what we're going to do is remove the block case bolts that hold 2 and 4 to 1 and 3. Then we will move this where 1 and 3 are facing up, and then we will remove actually before we do that, we'll loosen the bolts that hold 1 and 3 to 2 and 4. Then we will tilt this up on its side, remove these bolts, and pull the 2 halves apart. So these are 12.12mm bolts. They're pretty dang tight. So a long ratchet like this is a big help in getting these things to pop loose. Man. They're really tight. You can hear the pressure releasing. All right, we've got these two loose. This one loose. This one down here loose. This one up here loose. It's up here loose. All right. I'll just whip these out real quick. All right, now that those are removed, there's one that we can't forget about. Flip the block up. There's one small 10mm bolt right here to remove. All right, we got that little tin removed. Set that to the side. All right, now we're on the bank 1 side with cylinder 1 and 3. Now we're going to break free the 12.12 millimeters that are holding the block halves together. You guys ain't kidding when I said these things are on here tight. Off camera actually cracked this almost brand new. Actually, it is brand new. I've only had it a week. I bought it last week just specifically to tear down this, not this block, but the other block. And got a big crack in it. Cracked it already. Luckily, almost from looking at it, rounded out, old school snap-on 12 mil, 12 point, that if I look at the date stamp, it was manufactured in the early 80s. It took them out, didn't crack. But the brand new socket split on me. So there's that. I guess I'll be running down my Snap-on Man to get that replaced. Hopefully it's still got enough bite to run these out. At least partially. So, all right, now we've got that done. What I'm going to do is turn the engine back around and set it with this side up. We'll finish removing those bolts and we will split the case. All right, got the block up on its end. Finish removing the bolts. Whoops. All right, now all of our case bolts, engine block bolts are out, all the front, all down the spine, the 10 under here, the 12 back here, all our 12s between the cylinders. So now it's time to separate This is not the best practice for separating the engine block. You never want to strike aluminum with a hammer, but most likely I will not be reusing this block, so it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to be tapping under this flange here, which isn't very important, under this plug here, in this access hole back here for the torque converter bolts on automatics, and then back here on this overhang that you can't really see. And there's nothing really finely machined in those areas that's crucial to being perfect, and a couple wraps on the hammer is not going to cause any damage that would prevent this block from being reused or resealing in the future. So sometimes these things are really stuck together, sometimes it just takes a couple taps and they come apart, so we'll see which one this is. I can see it already starting to separate, so looks like this one will be fairly easy to get loose. Sometimes if you get a big enough crack started, you can get your pry bar in there and help pry the block halves off of the alignment dials, but be careful, you don't want to gouge the mating surface here all the way around because that has to seal. So be careful where you're sticking screwdriver blades and pry bars and prying these block halves apart. So what is the prescribed method for getting these apart? A rubber mallet and not a hammer, or put you a block of wood between your hammer you're striking with and the block. Like I said, I'm not going to be reusing this, probably about 90% sure, so no harm, no foul. This one is really stuck. There's an alignment dial right in here, and I think that's what's holding the block together right now from coming loose. All right, yep, that pin was really rusted, which doesn't surprise me, as rusty as this engine was and as rusty as the vehicle was. It's to be expected. All right, both of our alignment dowels are now freed up, so now we can simply lift 1 and 3 from 2 and 4. And there you go. Block halves are separated. See if I really boogered this up. Prying in there, and it looks like I'm good. A couple little areas on the very edge, but the sealing surface still seems to be all right. So we should be able to get away if we're using this block if we need to in the future. Again, here's cylinder 1's rod. I'm pretty sure this is going to be the worst rod bearing. A lot of play in it. I'm sure that's where our engine knock was coming from. So let me reframe here. No, actually, let's go ahead and pull the crankshaft. So all we got to do here Grab your rods. Do a bit of wiggle back and forth. Pull the crank straight up. Set it here on the bench. We'll get all this moved around and take a little better look before we remove the rods from the crank. Alright guys, a little bit of shaky cam here, going handheld real quick to go over the engine block halves. We don't really have any damage, like I said, on those corners where I was prying. Yeah, that's definitely a no-no. Bearings don't look completely trashed, but they do have quite a bit of wear on them. They're not as bad as the peanut butter milkshake engine, but I would not reuse them. Probably going to take some steels so you can see up close these bearings. And that said, I'll get these engine block halves out of the way, and we will tear these rods off of the crank, check the rod bearings, and finish the video out. Alright, down to the crank and rods. Again, here's number one. Pretty sure that's where our knock's coming from. Number 2, 3, 4. So, about 100% sure this one's going to be really trashed. Real quick, another do as I say, not as I do moment. I do not have a chrome 6.12 millimeter with me, and I do not want to crack these loose with that old rounded off 12 point. So, not advised. We're going to take the old impact and whip these off real quick. So the bearing actually stayed on our crankshaft. You can see there's a little bit of a burn where the bearing spun inside of the big end of the connecting rod. Let's see if we can get these bearings to peel off of here. Gnarly. So here is the rod bearing for cylinder 1. Definitely thrashed, and definitely the source of our engine knock. That is some oil starvation from when they ran it low on oil. Really, really bad. So, doesn't appear that it really destroyed the crank journal. This could probably be turned, but probably not one I'm going to do. This is kind of just for our curiosity and education for you guys. And as we look here, our rod bearing doesn't even fit in the connecting rod anymore. Completely spun. So NFG. So we'll set this aside, and just for fun, we'll go ahead and whip off all the other rods and see what their bearings look like. But that one is no good. Let's see what these other rod bearings look like. Well, this one looks actually fairly decent. Yep, this one not too bad at all. So number 2 was actually fairly good. One looks like our big problem child. I'll just check 3 and 4 real quick. And end our video out here. Okay, number 3's bearing fell out. Not horrible, but the bearing is very loose in the rod. Not a ton of bad stuff in here, but not great either. Got a little bit of galling on the bearings, but nothing compared to cylinder 1, of course. A lot of grit and junk on this crankshaft and these connecting rods. A lot of build up, I assume from poor oil change intervals. And number 4 seems to be fairly decent as well. So number 1 was our big problem child. All the rest were not horrible, but not great. So there goes our teardown of a Subaru short block on an EJ253. Starting from the short block going down to our stripped bare crankshaft. I'll probably take a couple snapshots of the crankshaft so you can see how those journals looked on the crankshaft, and that should do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.